MCT. We're going to get started in just a minute. Just a quick announcement, as usual, to plug Theory Thursdays. We are going to have Theory Thursdays this Thursday from 12 to 1:30 in the English 100, which is the unit office. And again, for those of you who don't know, just a reminder, this is a chance for people to get together, students, undergraduates from different departments, to talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity and theory. We can talk about the range of lectures, we can talk about what you all are covering in the MCT class, but just an opportunity to actually think about how to do theory in an interdisciplinary way, right, which is not actually intuitive. It requires a lot of work and a lot of conversation. So that will be going on, and there's coffee and donuts, although not as many as that. Okay, it is a tremendous pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Patricia Gherovici. She's a psychoanalyst and analytic supervisor. She's a co-founder and director of the Philadelphia Lacan Group and associate faculty of the Psychoanalytic Studies minor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an honorary member at IPTAR, the Institute for Psychoanalytic Training and Research in New York City, and a founding member of Das Übenhagen. And if you're interested in any of those institutes, then I'm sure there'll be time in question and answer to talk more about that. She's the author of numerous publications. I encourage you to check out her website, as well as acclaimed books. These include The Puerto Rican Syndrome from Other Press in 2003, winner of the Gradiva Award and the Boyer Prize. Please Select Your Gender, From the Invention of Hysteria to the Democratizing of Transgenderism, which is Routledge 2010. And Transgender Psychoanalysis, A Lacanian Perspective on Sexual Difference, that's Routledge 2017. She's published 2 edited volumes, both with Manya Steinkohler, one, Lacan on Madness, Madness, Yes You Can't, it's a great title, Routledge 2015, and Lacan, Psychoanalysis and Comedy, Cambridge University Press 2016. Most recently, she's published a collection with Chris Christian called Psychoanalysis in the Barrios, Race, Class, and the Unconscious. That's Routledge 2019. And I also have to say, she has the best book covers I have ever seen. I thoroughly love your attention to the visuals, so definitely check those out. She's also a public-facing intellectual and has given numerous interviews and written for The Guardian and the Philly Voice, among others. So it is my great honor to present to you Dr. Gherovici.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica Greenberg. Thank you for a very kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you today. When I was preparing my talk, I was asking myself, well, I'm invited to cover psychoanalysis, there was just the word psychoanalysis. And I asked myself, well, what can I say about psychoanalysis in 2019? And I start with a somber note. Are we here for a funeral, perhaps? Or perhaps we'll see whether or not maybe something needs to die in order for psychoanalysis to continue. And maybe I will tell you, since being alive has to do with accepting death as a factor, I will tell you about my own personal history. I left Argentina, where I was born and where I grew up and where I studied psychoanalysis. I live in the so-called world capital of psychoanalysis, Buenos Aires. And when I left Argentina in 1989, my friends, my Lacanian friends, from Villa Freud, there is even a neighborhood in Buenos Aires called Villa Freud, where you only have analysts office and cafes, properly named Freud, Jung, psychosis. So you could leave psychosis very quickly as soon as you're done with your macchiato. So they warned me. And they knew I was coming, I was moving to the US, and they said, forget the idea of practicing psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is dead in the US, they had killed it. So, with this ominous forecast, I followed this piece of advice with a dose of skepticism, and I arrived to the US in the midst of the so-called Freudian Wars. And I'm here showing you a cover from 1993, this is November of 1993, the covers of Time magazine, Is Freud Dead? And I was talking with Jessica. Indeed, this was 10 years before a very controversial show that took place in 2003. It was called Freud, Culture and Conflict. At the time, Freud was not only not clear whether or not he's dead or alive, there's a question mark, but in 2003, it was an exhibition that created an enormous controversy, and then it was redesigned several times. And in that Library of Congress exhibition that then traveled to New York and then traveled all over the world, Freud was reduced to a cultural product comparable to Andy Warhol. As psychoanalysis got its 15 minutes of fame. And among many of the artifacts one could see in the exhibit, there was a quote from Lacan, an apocryphal quote, saying, "It's up to you to be Lacanian. As for myself, I'm a Freudian." The interesting thing is that this famous quote of Lacan, apparently he never said that. I spoke with Diana Rabinovich, who organized this seminar. It was the last seminar that Lacan gave in his life, was in Caracas in 1980, a few months before he died, and she was checking the recordings. Apparently he never said that, but it doesn't matter. Myths have effect of truth, so it's interesting to see that, well, maybe Freud was not dead after all. Lacan didn't say those words, but founded a movement of Lacanism by claiming genealogy going back to Freud, to which I will go later. And maybe I will give you the context of what was happening in the 90s. The situation, there was questioning of Freud. After I arrived here, it was like celebrating Christmas. Every year or every couple of years, there was a cover with Freud in the cover, asking, is he dead? Is he not dead? This Newsweek alternated. So the question is he dead yet? Because I think the author of a movement needs to die for really, then we could inherit what he was really founding as a movement. And all these Freud wars, maybe the loss of traditional analytic strongholds, calls to bury Freud, make us confirm something that, as Theodor Adorno said, in psychoanalysis, nothing is true, but it's the exaggerations about it. Already in my practice in 1990s, my first clinical practice in the US was in the Barrio of North Philadelphia. There, I was having a very different experience. As an analyst, working with a population that is considered traditionally out of reach of the effects of the unconscious. And I often make this a silly joke, which is that people, even those with good political positionings, they maybe have left leanings, seem to be a little suspicious. How do you apply psychoanalysis to poor people? How do you adapt it? And in fact, apparently what they seem to imply is that poor people are too poor to afford to have an unconscious. Nobody would say that openly. But in my experience in the Barrio Clinic, the Anitas, the Margaritas, the Joses, the Socorros, with their ataque de nervios, with their hysteric symptoms of yesteryears, were showing me that psychoanalysis was not only needed, but reinvented in the Barrio. And this is what I practice. I call this the tunnel. It's a sort of situation in which the inhabitants of the barrio, because of the elevated subway, know there is a sky above, but never really have access directly to the sun. Nevertheless, could work very productively and make use of psychoanalysis, and proving that maybe there is no limit for working productively with the unconscious, and this is a process that one could dissolve in the clinical encounter, in the practice. So let's move forward now 30 years from the barrio to a text. I am very glad because I was able to collaborate in something that maybe could make us rethink not just about the past of psychoanalysis, but its future. And something very interesting is happening right now. ECRI, the whole work of one of the most important followers of Freud, Jacques Lacan, let's say his inheritor as it were, is condensed in this collection called Writings, ECRI, which is as important as it is impenetrable. It's one of the most obtuse collections of text, opaque, very difficult to tackle. And right now, I was very glad to be part of a project. There are 3 volumes coming up. Only the first and second. The second has been just recently published, like a month ago, in which philosophers, psychoanalysts, scholars from all over the world have contributed, making a very close, annotated edition, word by word, line by line, of each text in the ECRI. And this is very interesting because it's a publication that is taking place in English. There is not such a project in Portuguese or in French or in Spanish. These are all populations that have many, many Lacanian analysts. And it has happened in English. And not only that, it's often produced by people who speak English, like myself, with an accent. So it points to me to the existence of what I call a Lacanian English, that there is a specific way of reading the work of Lacan in the Anglophone world that is non-partisan and unprejudiced. It's an openness that unhappily that cannot take place in the context of the French Lacanian communities or Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking or Italian. Those are the big groups working in Lacan. So another thing that is happening, since I mentioned in the future, in 2 weeks from now, there will be a big gathering at Duquesne University to celebrate the publication of the second volume on the commentary of ECRI. Scholars from all over the world will gather at Duquesne University to prove that psychoanalysis is well and alive and worth discussing and continue working productively with these texts. So talking about maybe what we are dealing with, I will move on to one of the, for those who had a chance to read the assigned text, one of the texts I assigned as reading as a part of the bibliography for my presentation today was a text that it was my contribution to the collection of ECRI. It's a text from 1956 called Situation of Psychoanalysis. It's a situation of psychoanalysis and training of psychoanalysts in 1956. That seems to be a topical situation, 56. What do we care about more than 60 years later? What is very interesting working on that text is that it remains current, which is perhaps symptomatic, but also useful to listen to what Lacan had to say then that could still apply to what maybe means to be today a psychoanalyst. What does it mean to call oneself a psychoanalyst? And what does it mean to practice psychoanalysis that may not necessarily be authorized in the same way? And I will deal with that. So let's see something about situation. And for that, I need to exit to move. How do I go to the, well, maybe I will skip them that. To show a little clip, but escape. And
just double click. And then go ahead, continue. Yeah.
okay, we have a situation. So let's see what is the situation. And how do I go back to the slideshow?
So there's this little icon.
Okay. So we saw the little clip. This often in English, when we have a situation here, says the little boy, and calls for mom. It's a phrase that we often don't like to hear. We have a situation. It's often a call to somebody in a position of authority. It's an appeal to somebody who would intervene and restate the order. So what was Lacan saying by appealing? We have a situation here. Well, the situation Lacan was denouncing was a situation that he seemed to ascribe not so much to psychoanalysts themselves, but to the state of psychoanalysis in the 50s. It's interesting that this text, that is a programmatic text that was first published in a Journal of Philosophy, is also addressing the training of psychoanalysts. What makes someone become an analyst? Why would somebody want to become an analyst? And this is one of the questions that early in the text Lacan ascribes to a longhorn lady who pensively asks, why would you want to be an analyst? And she adds, I wouldn't like to live with a psychoanalyst. Indeed, we would wonder, why would anybody on earth want to become an analyst? According to Lacan, there is a transformation that takes place, that something in the process of analysis produces a desire to become an analyst, that somebody would want to turn the table around and move from being supine on the couch to be behind listening. How does that happen? And I will relate to another text that I gave us a reading for today, and it's a text that is often used whenever the specifics of the Lacanian modality of formation as an analyst, Lacan uses the word formation and not training, is not like preparing for a marathon, but rather is something that has to do with a form, with a transformation, a shaping. And I referred to a text called Proposition of October of 1967, in which at the beginning of that text, Lacan says, if you want to know what becoming an analyst is about, send them back to his earlier text of 1956. I will go rapidly through the text because we did this with my co-author. I co-authored that essay with Manja Steinkoller. We went against ourselves and did a very obsessional work discussing every single line and accounting for every word. So that's, I think, available for those who are curious. I would maybe sum up that text and mention a few important points by saying that this is a sort of summa symbologica of Lacan. It's the moment where Lacan is saying that something is already been lost in the 50s about the heritage of the Freudian corpus, that we need to return to Freud, to the Freudian terminology and the Freudian vocabulary. And he is very ironical in the text, sarcastic, gives a sort of scathing critique of the existing situation where already psychoanalysis in the 50s is very well accepted, seems to be having, if not the serious stamp of science, was, at least if we take the example of the US, was very popular at the time, and that in a way play against psychoanalysis by transforming it into a medical subspecialty, into a sort of what Lacan would call orthopedics of behavior that were going against the essence of what psychoanalysis was supposed to be. And he again insists on being faithful to the letter of the text of Freud, to the terminology, to attention to the language and the signifier, and that's a very close reading of Freud, trying to be as faithful as possible to the letter of what Freud proposed. He calls to the foundations of our research and is against the idea of ready-to-wear interpretations and is highlighting the basic tenets of psychoanalysis, the use of the fundamental rule, and the corresponding free-floating attention of the analyst, and trying to find a sort of antidote to the vagaries of fashions in psychoanalysis, culminating in a theorization of the analytic couple as a sort of failed model of humanism. He is stressing to follow the thread of the signifier, because he says that if we don't work with the materiality of language, with the speech of what the analyst brings, that is the only way we will aim at a sort of a moment of truth revealing the analytic process. We will be lost like in a sort of labyrinth, like in this labyrinth, mirrors, like in the Ariosto's palace of Atlantis, where illusion and reality melt, and only the thread of the signifier can guide us and find a way out. He's very, very critical about how the training is performed. He's using the, by way of Michelet's historical account of Louis XIV court-attended defecations, he's concluding that analytic training, in fact, is not only scatological, it's also like potty training. And following this sarcastic commentary, this follow the anal strain, he goes on to using Jonathan Swift to say that that in fact, what in the same way that they were examining the physics of the king to conclude the health of the king, there is some humorous take on excrements and smells, and feeling that maybe knowledge is reduced to maybe fecal matter. If we base, indeed, this idea, that's one of the propositions in this text, proposition of 1967, that psychoanalysis works with a different kind of knowledge that is not academic knowledge, but an unconscious knowledge that has to do with a different kind of truth, not a truth of information or quantification, but it will be a different type of truth that will often be surprising. And in order to make room for this surprise, the best way an analyst could be trained is following the laws of subjectivity that Lacan considers are mathematical. And that's when Lacan aligns psychoanalysis with what he calls the conjectural science, that psychoanalysis is speculative and is closer to, we may say, game theory, cybernetics. So we see that in a way what Lacan aims here is something that in other of the texts I suggested for reading would be a sort of a general education closer to the arts, to literature, to philosophy, to the history of myth, than a scientific model. The worst training for a psychoanalyst would be medical training. And interestingly enough, and that's part of the criticism of Lacan, the institutions of psychoanalysis had followed the model of the medical training, which is the model of the army. If the way people do in residence is boot camp. And that these are the two models that Freud takes when he does his study on ego analysis and group psychology. He borrows from that to Lacan to make a very sharp critique of how institutions of psychoanalysis, he is criticizing the International Psychoanalytic Association, the American branch, and he makes, the whole text should be read as a satire. For instance, he proposes that the IPA should be an independent state, and proposes that Ellis Island should be donated as a sort of tax-free nation to psychoanalysis, with all the history of Ellis Island, which is sort of, will have all psychoanalysts in quarantine and sort of, and then foreigners who could never leave this position. Earlier in the text, he emphasizes that the position of the psychoanalyst is that of a foreigner, and follows a story of Montesquieu of two Persians who traveled to Paris and tell stories of costume, how Parisians live with this amazing distortion of somebody who doesn't really understand what's happening. And this is the position of the analyst. I think an analyst is more productive when the analyst doesn't know anything. And this is why I know anything in the sense of understanding. It's not about comprehension, it's about a revelation of a knowledge that does not reside in the knowledge. Of course, analysts may know a couple of things here and there, but should suspend that knowledge and adopt a position of we may call ignorantia docta, following Nicolas Cusanus. And if there is a knowledge in the analytic interaction, will emerge from the unconscious of the analysand. And that's the only useful knowledge produced in the process. Doesn't matter how many diplomas the analyst may have or knowledge in the sense of accumulation. So we see that in the way Lacan is presenting the idea of psychoanalysis is introducing a dialectic that will be carried away. And one thing I wanted to mention maybe is in this proposition, how he concludes this text situation in what we may call is a sort of energizing manner. He says that psychoanalysis has managed to sustain itself without any reference to Freudian concepts, and in a way has lost its soul. It's interesting to know that the word psychoanalysis that Freud invented, he invented this idea of psychoanalysis, putting the emphasis that the word psycho, Suche, in German, excuse my pronunciation, I don't speak German, but for those here who may speak German, when we say psychoanalysis in German, Psychoanalyse, the emphasis is on this first part of the word, the Psycho, which is the soul. That for Freud was important to maintain the idea that analysis, that would mean cutting in the small pieces, was about the soul and not the mind, which is the mistranslation of Strachey. And this is something that Bruno Mettel have noted, and that there is something of the soul of psychoanalysis that has been lost in translation and has been lost in the institutionalization of psychoanalysis. And this is what Lacan is aiming at trying to deinstitutionalize psychoanalysis. And this is how, in this text proposition of 1967, he's talking about the model of the past, and we could discuss what does it mean and whether or not that was actually a successful experiment. He ends the text in what he calls an energizing manner, stating that psychoanalysis is in a state of affairs that he compares to the story of Edgar Allan Poe's and a short story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. The character of the story is kept alive exactly at the moment of his death by hypnosis. So we have Valdemar, Kate in this state of putrefaction between life and death. The body is almost dissolving, is hideous, and Valdemar is kept nevertheless in this state of limbo, neither dead nor alive. And there may be the spell of ego psychology kept in this intermediary state, in this kind of hypnosis, in a sham life support, for someone who is already dead. So when Valdemar wakes up from the hypnosis, he dissolves in a liquid rot. Lacan's text functions perhaps as a sort of wake-up call that calls the dead to be buried so that psychoanalysis, as Freudian, can be finally transmitted. So it's interesting that Lacan is quoting Poe, and this is a text of 1956 that is contemporary with a seminar that he gave on Poe, working on Poe's Purloin letter, delivered in 1955 and written in 1956. And so he's in a way, like the character in the Pour One Letter, a sort of Dupin, a sort of detective that is trying to save us from dupeness. And it's interesting to know that a year later, in 1957, Lacan appears in the cover of a magazine, a popular magazine in France, L'Express, in an interview. And there is a delight to read for those who want to escape the labyrinth of écrit. He's crystal clear. So when he wanted, Lacan could be clear and get out of the situation and become a public intellectual as well. So it's interesting that Lacan's satirical take in situation could collab with the word situation, other type of situation, and I refer to the Situationist, to Guy Debord, who published the report on the construction of situations in 1957, a year later. It was the founding manifesto of the Situationist International. A few years later, Debord, in 1952, had released a film whose title I think Lacan would have loved, was Hurlement en faveur des Sades, House for Sad. And like Debord, Lacan wanted to revolutionize life by criticizing the institution, the International Psychoanalytic Association, as a society of spectacle, and creating a situation that he could be deconstructed for something new, maybe a revolution, to emerge. I want to maybe move on to now the present time. For many critics of Lacan, one of the most objectionable things are, especially in the US context, is Lacan's use of the variable session. It's often described as a short session. And I think it's often a mistake, because to be effective, the session has to be variable. Means that in my own practice, it's often longer rather than shorter. At times, patients and Allisons prepare a session in advance, so they have beautiful 50 minutes, minute 51, something interesting shows up. So sessions, in my practice, are more Freudian than a Lacanian, I would say. My sessions tend to be longer rather than shorter, but they vary in length. And this strategy of the changing the duration of the session is to introduce a cut that Lacan describes as an escansion, is a punctuation that resignifies the preceding statements. And may happen, for instance, in a session that slip of the tongue happens, and it's important to stop there because it may resignify the work. It's hard to talk about the variable session in a context where time is money. But one needs to think that psychoanalysis takes the time of psychoanalysis is a process that takes place also between the sessions. Someone in analysis is in analysis not only when lying on the couch in the office, but during the process that that person is undergoing analysis. And events may affect the progress of analysis and may happen outside the specific session. So one of the things that often is voiced against Lacan is this issue about a major transgression, variable sessions. Nobody seems to care about other maybe major sins, that he was perhaps a terrible father or ended up having an affair with a former Allison. Those things apparently are more easily forgiven. One, I think, was the biggest sin or ascribable sins in Lacan is how irreverent he was facing institutions, a sort of anarchist side to Lacan. And as noted by Jacqueline Rose, it's important that we not to forget that psychoanalysis is not just a theory and a practice, but also something that produces psychoanalysis. And it's important that in that aspect, Lacan was extremely revolutionary and offered a total transformation of the field. And that's one of the things I want to discuss today. I was mentioning that I am more a Freudian than a Lacanian. In what concerns me, I call myself a Freudio-Lacanian. There are some Lacanians who think that one cannot be both a Freudian and a Lacanian. There are some Lacanians who haven't read Freud. I think that it's impossible to read Lacan if one hasn't read Freud first. And in my practice, I find helpful to have this more Freudio-Lacanian position, and we could discuss what would that entail in terms of the practice. When Lacan talked about the formation of analysts, he used the word authorization, not certification. It's not that you get a diploma, or as in New York, in the state of New York, for instance, you can be a licensed psychoanalyst. You get a permit to conduct the treatment, like a driver's license. And indeed, you can have a little ID that I think for the LP, the licensed psychoanalyst. I think what is interesting in Lacan that he uses the word authorization playing with the ambiguity of the term, because he, as famously he said, he has a formula. The analyst authorizes himself or herself. He's highlighting that being an analyst is not a title granted by an institution. We don't get a diploma saying psychoanalyst, but it's an act, it's an assumption, it's a responsibility that somebody assumes, and is located in this dialectic, in this area of ambiguity between author, a composer of a work, and authority, having the power of control. So he's playing with this author and authority function. And it's important that the root of these words, in the Latin, is from augere, which means to become, to grow, to increase, to augment. So it suggests a futurity, like in the word augur. Clinical psychoanalysis concerns them both, the authority of the past and the futurity, a projection of authorship, where it was, there, I shall become. It's interesting, this element of futurity, because of all places, the slide I chose at the beginning was Time. Time magazine. Temporality plays an important role in the analytic process, and it's a different kind of, the time of the unconscious. That's why the variable session is quite important. We are not working with chronological time, with a time of resignification of après-coup, retroactive. In clinical work, this dialectic of authority is ever present. When one speaks in analysis, who authorizes oneself to speak, and what authorizes an intervention in analysis, what makes an intervention an interpretation or just a comment. So I think it's interesting who is the author and who is authorizing oneself. Often this choice of self-authorization takes some distance from what we may call the big other, moral duty, law, institutional or social customs, and the like. It's a radical and simple formula, this principle of self-authorization, that implies as well an ethical decision. It forces the analyst to make an ethical decision. I am an analyst is also an affirmation of being that results from this desire I was mentioning earlier, that is produced by one's own personal analysis. And it's always sort of surprising, the moment when one could say, I became an analyst. And so I will share with you a little of my own personal history. My first experience of psychoanalysis was as an analyst, as a child, followed by, that was the first analysis, by a second analysis as an adolescent, a third one as a young adult, and the last tranche, as they say in French, or slice, in my late 20s until my mid-30s. I worked with analysts that were Anna-Freudian, Kleinian, Freudian, and Lacanian. And I came to authorize myself as an analyst in a context where psychoanalysis was not supposed to happen and was not even expected. And I was not even supposed or even permitted to be an analyst, but was the only thing I knew how to do. And I was hired in a clinic. My official title was staff psychologist. And I'm referring to my barrio job when I was in a mental health clinic in the Bloque de Oro in North Philadelphia. And in that context, I have an office. The building, in better times, used to be a funerary house. Beautiful wooden paneling, a carpet that was almost a living organ, had all these movements, brownish orange, strange, always. It was a lively presence, to say the least. And I think that my office, with that incongruous, luxurious wooden paneling, was the room where the coffins were brought for viewing, talking about death. So in that setting, I moved around the chairs. I had a beautiful tanker desk in metal. I moved it to the side, and I create a sort of Freudian theater. And I took the position maybe of the dummy or the dead in French. And I played dead, maybe in the former room for viewing. And there I was supposed to be seeing clients. But all I knew, had trained in Argentina in psychoanalysis, was I could not help but listen to the unconscious. And my analysans were then analysans. It's interesting I use that word from the start. People who came to the clinic were mostly of Puerto Rican origin, had no problem telling me about the dreams and associated. Before maybe being in treatment, they also ascribe a lot of value to dreams, but to play lotto. So, but they would write them now, the content of the dream. So they were very open and very willing to, and felt that that was a sort of natural continuation of something that was understood as of value. And talking about that, from the window of my office, when I would water the plants, I would at times think of those coffins brought for viewing, but also I would witness drive-by shooting. The life in the barrio, as you may know, is like living in a sort of war field. Every day I would hear a report of a death. Maybe somebody close in the family, or a neighbor, or somebody who knew somebody. So there was this urgency in the clinical work of living on the verge between life and death. So in that context is where maybe not being able to do cognitive therapy, because I wasn't trained that way, not knowing much about family therapy either, I found myself working with a population that is supposed to be out of the reach of the unconscious. My only supposition was that they could work productively, and that was confirmed. Talking about working productively with the unconscious, I will move rapidly to my first clinical example, and it would be that of a case that is one of the most controversial cases of Freud, and is often not a case. When we talk about Freud's case, most people talk about Dora's case, the Ratman, Schreber, I think is the most written case in the whole history of psychiatry. But nobody talks about a patient who in the Freudian corpus doesn't have a name. Dora has Dora. The Ratman doesn't have a name either. Schreber has his own proper name, and it's interesting because he's not a patient of Freud. Freud works on a memoir. But in the case of we have a patient that is described by Freud as the young female homosexual. Already the title could be controversial from the start. It's written a little dry, like a medical report. That reminds me of this report. These images are from a comic series that lasts only 5 or 6 issues, that is a testimony to the popularity of psychoanalysis in the 50s. And here the protagonist is 19 years old, almost like the case I will discuss rapidly. It's a very rich case, but in the interest of time, I will just mention a few focal points, and maybe in the discussion we could return to it. I will call her Sidonie, and I choose that name based on something quite interesting, which is this memoir that is soon coming it's not really a memoir, it's a narrative biography, to be more precise. This is a text that was published in German in 2000 and then republished in 2012, translated to, this is the version in French, this is the original in German. There is also a version in Spanish and another one in Portuguese. the protagonist of the story described in the case is this lady that we see here at age 99. So the secret for longevity is psychoanalysis. She lived 99 years and had an amazing life. Lived in Cuba, the US, Thailand, Brazil. There are two women, Diane Boyd, and Ines Ryder, met her through family relatives and discovered that she was the famous, because she's not naming, and most of the identities of the cases, like we know that Anna O was Berta Pappenheim, all the big players in the cases known in the Freudian corpus are known, but we didn't know who was this young female homosexual. Turns out that the name in the narrative biographies is Sidonie Silag, that means star, Silag, and that's not her real name. It was only disclosed after her death at the age of 99 in 1999. She was born with a century. That's why the title of the biography, they change it in languages. In French is homosexual in Freud, lesbian in the century. Because she lived through important historical events. And her real name is Margaret Trautenegg. And for those who are interested in research, and I see many that are young enough, the letters are sealed in the Library of Congress. They will be open in 2049. So for those interested, we have a few years to wait. We can see the material of the personal letters, and some of the material is already available in the Freud Museum in Vienna. And at December of this year, this biography is coming out in English. And it's a fantastic, it reads like a feuilleton. It's because she has a very adventurous, interesting life, but also give us an interesting answers to the questions left unresolved by Freud. This case shows, on the one hand, the genius of Freud, who is not ashamed to publish a failed case. Freud famously failed with this case because she was a patient who came to see Freud without any symptom. She had no symptom, no complaint. She was 18 at the time, was brought by her father. Already that's not the ideal setup. And was supposedly brought to be cured of her homosexuality. Freud was not that naive. He knew that that was not something psychoanalysis is supposed to cure. In fact, why would you cure that, was the question of Freud. In fact, in the same way, we cannot cure heterosexuality, we cannot cure homosexuality. These are not illnesses. These are circumstances equally contingent, Freud would claim. So he knew that that was already not the ideal setup, that satisfaction guarantee or your money back was not going to work if she was brought by the family with that intention. Also, she was not engaged in her symptoms. Often, for a treatment to be successful, a symptom, Freud says, don't get rid of it too soon, but involves a subject. Here we have somebody without any hysterical symptom or any symptom, any complaint even. And she was brought after a failed suicidal gesture. She was, at the time, in love with an older lady of very bad reputation. The way Freud describes her, she was nothing but a cocotte, meaning an elegant French word to mean a prostitute, or not really a prostitute, a woman of dubious moral behavior, a sort of libertine, and was having an affair with an older lady. Fantastic from the biography. This is Sidonie later on. This is in Cuba, when she lived in Cuba with a friend. This was the lady she was in love with. How old do you think she is? When they were having an affair, was an older lady, according to the notes. 28. Well, maybe if we put a fur coat and the veil. And this was a baroness, we learn in the biography. Sidonie was very in love with her, but this is the reading that Lacan would do of the case. She was in love in a very specific type of love. She was in love with her, courting her, following the model of courtly love. Sidonie was not so interested in the pleasure of the flesh, but in pursuing, like a knight would pursue a lady, she was pursuing this lady, Leonie, we learn in the biography, the Baroness. The family was horrified that she had a same-sex attraction, and on top of that, this woman with a terrible reputation. There is an event that we learn that is the kernel of what brings Sidonie to Freud, is that she was walking on the streets of Vienna, happens to see her father, they run into him on the street. He throws an irate look at them. The lady asks, who is that man? It's revealed that is the father of Sidonie, who had told Sidonie not to be with that lady. And the gesture of defiance fails. She's overwhelmed by this situation, throws herself to an underpass, some trolley rails that are underground, and tries a suicidal gesture, happily survives, but is brought to treatment, to Freud, to see what's happening. The interpretation of Freud is very Lacanian, we may say, because he follows the thread of the signifier, the one he's talking about in 1956. He realized that the word in German for falling is, to fall is also niederkommen. That means also when a baby, giving a baby, having a baby during childbirth. So he would make this analysis that there was a sort of wish to have a baby. That's a very Oedipal interpretation that we may disagree with, that at the time when there was a relieving of the Oedipal tendencies, when Sidonie was hoping to have a child by the father, happens to be that her mother is pregnant with a younger brother that is 17 years younger than her, and instead of having the child of the father, the mother actually has this baby with her father, and this failed suicide is a way of falling and giving birth at the same time. What we discover in Freud's interpretation is that he's erring in a fabulous way, because he has the prejudice of believing that there is the Oedipal matrix that will fulfill a sort of predestined attraction, the girl for the father, the boy for the mother. And also, what the biggest mistake of Freud is in the transference, because something very interesting happened. Sidonie, even though she's brought to the treatment, has dreams and shares those dreams with Freud, and has lying dreams, because she dreams that she meets a man, gets married, and makes happy Freud, the family, and heterosexuality and heteronormativity. But Freud is not naive to believe that this is not really her desire, but cannot tolerate the idea that she's lying to him. There's a sort of broken promise. And it's interesting that Freud is aware that he's occupying the transference, he says, the position of the father. The father clearly plays a central role, and Lou Andrea Salome, when she learns about the case, is very critical of Freud and says that was the moment where the analysis could really have started, when she withdraws from what is seemingly positive transference to negative transference, and when Freud is occupying the position of the father. And this mistake of Freud is, in fact, a category mistake, because he cannot read in transference the structure of repetition that he can make good use. And in the same way that we could see that her throwing herself over the railroad was a sort of acting out, or in the Lacanian perspective, almost a passagal act, where there is no that much room for speech. It's not a message addressed to another to be interpreted by an action that is perhaps too successful and doesn't give much room for rewriting of the event. But he also produces an acting out comparable Freud, because he gets rid of Sidonie, and when she comes to the session, and he describes in a beautiful way that she's receiving the interpretations of Freud like a lady that is brought to a museum and shown very boring objects, and she's, yes, totally uninterested, looking at these dusty old things that are not really things she cares about. And gets rid of Sidonie and refers her to a female analyst, feeling that only another woman could deal with the issues Sidonie needed to work with. What Lacan does in his rereading of the case, he follows Freud in the interpretation of the Niederkommen, this signifying play, but is focusing on what happened with the transference, and also the possibility that Freud, in the same failure that Freud had with Dora. When Freud writes about this case and publishes, the case takes place a few months in 1919, publishes relatively soon after in 1920 the case, he adds a footnote to the case of Dora. Dora and Sidonie have similar structures. There is a triangulation with an older woman who knows about sexuality in an experiential way. Dora, because she was having an affair and was a woman who maybe knew how to pleasure a man even if he was impotent. This woman of ill repute seems to know something about pleasure, was reputed to live in a menage a trois, have many affairs, change from husband to husband, but clearly take husbands just as providers of money, and have a sort of very open enjoyment of her sexuality, which at the time was quite rare. So we have this similar situation, and Freud is able to understand his own prejudice, that he presupposes a sort of heteronormative outcome of desire, both with Dora and both with Sidonie, and both make him fail horribly in the analysis. And maybe that would be a way of something I've been talking about that a lot, that psychoanalysis needs to get cured of its own heteronormativity that is in a way anti-Freud, and those are moments where Freud is anti-Freudian. If we look at, for instance, ways that Tim Dean has read very well, if we read the three essays, there is a sort of way of reading Freud if the notion of the drive is in itself queer. So we could make a reading of Freud that goes against Freud, and if this is maybe, we're talking about what it's like to be an analyst, maybe to be an analyst today is that I position myself as a Lacanian who could be critical of Freud, or maybe as a Lacanian that could be critical of Lacan as well. I think in order to maintain psychoanalysis alive, we need to continue this dialectical movement. To maybe go, because I want to have time for the discussion, so I will maybe, this is again, there she looks closer to 28, not yet. But royal. So, I think what is important to know, what we learned through the biography, and if you're interested, I recommend, I'll give you the detail. It will be published in December of this year. It's by a press that specializes in Eastern Europe. It's a Central Eastern European history. It's the Helena History Press, and the title will be The Story of Sidonie C., which is the translation from the German, Freud's famous, quote, case of female homosexuality. And Freud was always complaining that his cases read like novellas. Well, this is it's better than, I think is when reality is larger than fiction. So I strongly recommend it. So I think what I would rescue from the case of the way one could read productively the case with the help of Freud and Lacan, by being both critical of both Freud and Lacan, would be by using something that Lacan gave us. Here I have, this is when she lived in Cuba. This is a good confirmation of courtly love, because this is for a costume party, dressed as a chevalier. This is in a cabriolet. This is the place where she jumped. Because when we read the case, and it's a little confusing, she jumped over the rails. It's hard to imagine that would be a suicidal gesture, but she fell from quite high. This is contemporary Vienna, but we could see that the overpass is still there. And she then spent months on her back, had a severe injury. She could have died. So it wasn't a simple theatrical gesture. It was really a desperate moment for her. And what we learn in the biography is there are 2 more suicidal attempts, one poison, and the other she shot herself in the heart. And they all are addressed to the father. So Freud was right and wrong. She wants to get rid of, and she goes back to the lady that brought her to treatment, and she tries to get rid of her and forges a letter pretending to be her father and said, "You should not have contact with my daughter." Then when she shoots herself, she missed the heart for 1 inch. She could have died. But thus, in the family house, after an engagement party, she was going to marry a man. She was obviously not interested, realizes she cannot do that. The wedding was ready, they had the dress. It was immediately after the engagement party, and it's addressed to the father because the father drives her to the hospital. She stays with the father in the recovery. So there is something of her love addressed to the father. According to Lacan, it's about maybe knowledge, showing the father what real love is, and maybe confirming Lacan's formula, is to give what one doesn't have, perhaps to somebody who doesn't want it. What I find very helpful to reread critically the case of is this opaque greed, is Lacan's formula of sexuation. We don't need to leave this lecture with a headache. I will only say a couple of things. If you want, we could go more in depth into the formula in the discussion. What I find extremely helpful, and is for me a very helpful tool in my clinical practice for any analysis, cis or trans or with or without gender trouble, because it's talking about taking a position that as sex beings, would say Lacan, one needs to take a position, or like Sidonie, fall on one side or the other. And I think this formula of sexuation, what they offer, is the possibility of thinking about sexual difference in terms of positionings that do not depend on anatomical borders, but rather on self-authorization. Because in a later seminar, Lacan would say, he or she who calls themselves a woman or calls themselves a man. So I find that very helpful because it's outside the constraints of course, absurd biological destinies, but also it's a self-authorization, and even later on, Lacan would use the formula I referred earlier on of the analysts authorize themselves for sex positions. These are positions that are determined by ways of jouissance. The way I happen to enjoy or embody my sexuality is how I position myself, and it has to do with a specific relationship to the phallus. That would be completely determined by the phallus or not all determined by the phallus. And it would be a male or female side. But again, it's an act of self-authorization on speech. So I will conclude, and maybe with this idea that one needs to take sides. And there are positionings, and what I think is interesting is that there are mobile positionings. They could change. In a specific moment, one could occupy a positioning or not, and move between one side or the other. That maybe could help us rethink the case of Sidonie. Was Sidonie maybe, because there are interesting elements, was her fascination with the lady something about the mystery of femininity that she embodied, or as Marcian Blevy was saying, it was also much about what is a woman, or rather, what am I for my mother, because Sidonie had a horrible relationship with her mother. The mother, it was a beautiful woman, but she was not very loving with her. In fact, was in a constant situation of rivalry, and there are many events in the biography of horrible, painful situations where she feels unloved by the mother, and that maybe the story of Sidonie was more about love and searching for something in the love of the mother that would help her assume a sexual positioning, and a mother who was positioning herself perhaps as the woman who does not exist, that with capital W, that Lacan says it doesn't exist unless in a sort of projection onto psychosis, a woman who has not undergone castration. And we could talk about what would that mean. A woman, because there was something with the beauty of the mother, Emma Silag, that was a way maybe of denying even her own mortality. Because at age 80-something, she was still thinking that there were all these admirers following her, and there was a sort of delusional, maybe erotomania. So, to conclude, because I want us to have time for discussion, I would say that following Lacan, when one needs to, in order to exist in the world, we need to assume a positioning that is sex. We live in a society that in order to exist, and this is something that early on Freud noted, that when we run on the street, when we run into a stranger, the first assumption we make is a gender assumption. And it's always a misconception. We know it's a construction, but why is it that we need to establish this type of difference? And this for me has important echoes, because what I learned in my practice with those analysants who identify as trans is that at times certain types of embodiment make life almost impossible. For instance, when I hear from an analysant who says, if I would not have transition, I would have killed myself, one realizes that perhaps behind all these issues about assuming a side that will be gendered in a certain way, or male, female, or anything else altogether, is something about existence, something about being that emerged, that may have relationship to this issue about love. Because love, as again, that's an interesting thing that Tim Dean noted, is Lacan has a beautiful quote that says that in matters of love, gender is irrelevant. So there is something about being at stake. So this is perhaps this idea that we need to assume a position to make life possible, a sex position, that has to do with self-authorization in speech. So it's important that then the authorization is not from an other, but is generated in oneself. And we see here a parallel. Lacan is using the same formula for authorizing an analyst in its position, its intervention as an analyst, and authorizing a subject in its sex being. So I think it's important, because to authorize oneself as a man, woman, or something else altogether involves something of an ethical decision that would point to something that we may call a new ethics of sexual difference. As David Lichtenstein has noted, to become a psychoanalyst today, to be authorized as an analyst, is perhaps to traverse an impossible crossroad. But, as we well know, Freud described psychoanalysis as an impossible profession. Governing, educating, and psychoanalyzing are three impossible professions. So we know about impossibles here in an academic setting. Maybe today with news, we've heard rumors of impeachment. Maybe governing is also another impossible. And psychoanalysis, the topic today. So I will conclude by saying that for me today, being a Lacanian is not being any kind of Freudian, but a political Freudian. Going back to my experience in the barrio, I align myself with the Freud of the free clinics. I don't know if you are familiar with Elizabeth Danto has a beautiful book documenting that between the two wars, one forgets, because people ask me, oh, you do psychoanalysis in the barrio, this is a new thing. And in fact, this is the most traditional thing. The roots of psychoanalysis were not in the barrio, but were very, very maybe socially conscious and perhaps radical. So it's reclaimed that political past of psychoanalysis. Also, psychoanalysis had a sort of interesting past. I discovered with great surprise that one of the first psychoanalytic institutes in the whole world, the Berlin Society, Psychoanalytic Society, founded at the beginning of the 20th century, was co-founded by Hirschfeld, an activist and the founder of sexology. Psychoanalysis, sexology, gender non-normativity, they were all close together. Unhappily, prejudice prevailed. Hirschfeld left soon the Berlin Psychoanalytic Society. Apparently, Jung objected to his homosexuality. But I think we need to go back to that beginning to send psychoanalysis into the future. And maybe being a critical Freudian, a critical Lacanian, but intervening in the field in ways that would help refine it and perhaps reinvent it. That's what I think we do every time we have an analysis. We don't know. If we think we know anything in the session, it's wasted time. When we think we didn't understand anything, something new will happen. The unconscious is always having, whenever it emerges, there is an effect of surprise. So the possibility of surprising ourselves, psychoanalysis, and produce something new, a truth that was unexpected. And maybe that's how we can think of a futurity of psychoanalysis. Thank you. Yes?
Okay, we have a chance. If we'll just give it a minute. If folks have to go, please do so quietly and quickly. But I want to make sure we have time for a few questions. So why don't we just take a second? You can take a sip of water, and we'll start. So, does anybody want to start with a question? Yeah. Okay. So, let's focus. Patricia, we have a question here.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful lecture. I would like to know, I know that when we talk about Freud and psychoanalysis, we think about dreams and the subconscious. And he thinks that whatever happens to us in our dreams comes from the subconscious and whatever activity we might have engaged in during the day. So what is his view as far as dreams are concerned, and as far as seeing dreams as a means of divine communication? What does he think about that? Not seeing dreams as a result of our previous activities, but seeing dreams as a result of a divine communication about what is going to happen to human beings in the future.
Yeah, the divine thing, there is a nice, Jean-Luc Nancy, I think it's the introduction to the translation of Freud to Japanese. He said that psychoanalysis is the last atheist practice, that psycho is not religious. It would not take God into account. But he said that the problem is that it's so atheist that doesn't even believe in itself. That's problematic. But nevertheless, and that's some people have taken that, Freud has a text on psychoanalysis and telepathy. At times, strange things happen in the office, and I can share that with you. There are other ways subjects communicate that is not consciously, that at times I open the door of my office, I look at my analysis, and I may know things. But the key of psychoanalysis is that if I would say whatever I could read, like people read in the tarot, that's something in the text of Situation, it's not about reading the future, but the way psychoanalysis works and is truly effective is because the analysant needs to hear themselves. They need to hear themselves saying something for that saying to have a different resonance. That's why talking to an analyst is different from talking to a friend, because when the analysant talks to the analyst, is listening to themselves differently. That's why when you talk to a friend, you don't pay so much attention to your work. When you're talking to the analyst, that may punctuate, say, and also what the analyst does is may return what you say, repeat a phrase or stop there and you realize you said something that you couldn't hear yourself saying. So in a way, if there is a God in a sort of Deus ex machina, something moving, would be the unconscious of the analysant. Whereas dreams, what the Freud takes, why does he work on dreams? Because he believed that dream production, rather than being these strange, crazy neurons, working at night and doing strange short circuits, is that he believes that meanings that dreams have meaning. I have a nice condensation, that dreams are meaning, they have meaning. But the way Freud will read dreams, he takes the model of a rebus, how hieroglyphics were written, that you would have a capsule with different images in which each little image, the little bird or the little cross, would represent phonemes, and he says that we need to read a dream as we will read a text. But what is, I think, interesting for me as an analyst is that when an analysant brings a dream, I don't know what it means, nor does the analysant. But the one who has the decoder, let's say the Champollion stone that would translate the hieroglyphic into maybe Greek or Latin or whatever, or Aramaic, is that the analysant would associate with pieces of the dreams, word by word, and something will be revealed, something new will emerge. And there will be always this effect of surprise, but at the same time of recognition. That's why, in a way, the one who does the most work in the session is not the analyst, but the analysant. That would be the God, or the messenger for this deity.
Thank you for the lecture, and I have a question about transference, language, symptom, and translation.
Yes.
So I want to ask you, as a practicing psychoanalyst, do you think that language, to what extent understanding in a session is important? Can you have an effective session with someone whose language is not like, whose native language is not English or not Spanish? So to what extent understanding is important in a transference, and how can you convey your understanding of the symptoms to someone who is not actually understanding what you're saying quite well?
Yeah, well, what you're saying, I don't think psychoanalysis is about understanding.
About desire. Well,
but it is important. You need to know enough of the language to catch the possibility to capture the potential for misunderstanding. Because I think what our weapon is equivocation. That's what Lacan advised. It's the only weapon. And if you're not that proficient in the language, I could not do analysis in German. But for instance, we found very helpful the fact that English is not my first language. Because English is, I thought, initially I was working in the barrio, I wasn't working in Spanish, I was working in Spanglish, which is a language of transliteration between English and Spanish. And a new language for me. I didn't know anything about Spanglish before working in the barrio. What I think is important that you need to have, as an analyst, enough of the command of the language your analysant choose to speak in to capture the potential for polysemy, for equivocation. When, for example, I have analysts who choose to work in English and it's not their first language. And I ask them, what, they have a word in a dream. So, well, what, if you describe it, say, I dream about a dinner. Well, how would you say dinner in your native language? And at times the association will be to that word and something, but again, the one with the possibility of confirming the meaning is the analysis. I just could hear something and point with a question. That's why it's interesting when we're talking about Time magazine temporality. An interpretation is only an interpretation retroactively. We do interventions that could function as interpretation if something worked. At times we just said something.
And then I want to ask you, what has to do, like, is psychoanalysis related to the concept of the nation state? And if you need the understanding of the language that is like national language, then can we establish like Psychoanalytic International to practice psychoanalysis as a radical, as a radical?
Yeah, that would be one of the.
This. And how then we deal with the presence of the languages as a national languages?
Yeah.
So we need to do something with it. But
absolutely. One other thing is that an analysis that took place in one language, like translating a joke. When you translate a joke, already when you explain a joke, it's no longer funny. So there you would see that psychoanalysis is not about explaining. It's no longer funny. And psychoanalysis at times could be fun. Not always, but you could laugh. So if you explain a joke, that is no longer funny. You cannot. It's not about explaining, and you cannot translate. When a type of joke works in the polysemy in one specific language, cannot be translated. And it's interesting the idea of an international. Is there such a thing? Like
and can there be laughter that can be understood by people speaking different languages?
Yeah, some joke can be translated, others cannot.
Yeah.
So. But indeed, the idea of an international psychoanalytic, then you could say, I think we need also to take it a little more metaphorically. When Lacan says the unconscious structure like a language, let's not forget the like a language. It's not a language. The same is like a language. So it's borrowing the structure, it's not the specifically.
Thank you.
Can you explain more about the semantics of Lacan's formula of sexuation and how that's useful to you in your practice and thinking?
Yeah, because I think what is useful of the formula of sexuation is that it proposes a way of thinking about sexual difference not fully dependent on the phallus. That if you take, and then we have to think what is the phallus. The phallus for Lacan is a signifier. And one way of escaping the limitations of phallocentrism, if we think of this expression that one could talk of a trophy wife, there we could see that the phallus is not an organ, or a big red car could be a phallus. It's not anything. When we read Freud, we could confuse the organ and phallus as a signifier. In Lacan, it's more clear. But perhaps the phallus has been around for too long. Maybe we no longer need the phallus to think about sexual difference. In that sense, I find it helpful because what it proposes is one side, the male side, is fully dependent on the phallus. Let me see. No, this is. Okay. So here you have. There is. So it says that everyone, all X is how you will read. The E, there exists X, no feed X, all X feed X. So we have the top would be the exception, the foundational exception that creates the universal. You can have an universal of men. Is the idea of totem and taboo because there is a man who has all the women. The sons kill him. The law starts. So all this works within the phallic modality. But for the right side, the female side, we have the la cross would be this phrase that Lacan says the woman does not exist. It's not that there are no women, but there is no universal feature that you could not have a set of all women are this, where you could do that on the male side if you relied on the phallic premise. So it frees us from the tyranny of the phallus. That's what I take from the formula of sexuation. And the other thing that is important, for me, the most important element in the formula of sexuation is this, the bar. That even where there was all this, if Lacan talked about urinary segregation, there was a lot of controversy. Restrooms accessible to everyone who needs to use a restroom and doesn't have to be gender segregated, but that's what Lacan says, that we live in a society where when you're in a public space and you need to satisfy your most basic and most urgent needs, you need to declare a gender. And you may have seen in the signs, every time you have a sign, and I do this experiment, if you find a refutation to this, send it to me, but every time, even when it's all gender restrooms, there is a line. And it's sexual difference. It doesn't matter. Gender is just a way of failing. And this is another thing. The formula of sexuations are two ways of failing. Facing sexual abuse. The male way of failing or the female or anything else altogether. That I think is a way out of heteronormativity. That's that. Yeah.
It's a wonderful lecture. I was just thinking with the gender thing, I was thinking that I was surprised to see in Philadelphia at one of the big conference hotels for an NLA conferences that they actually have now a third category for bathrooms. I don't remember exactly how the signs look like, but I think things like all gender or gender neutral or something like that. So it is introduced in some public places.
It is, but often it has a bar. It's like the Saussurean bar. It's the signifier. It's like we cannot get rid of it.
Yeah. But actually, my question would go in a different direction. You talked about the self-authorization of psychoanalysts that at some point see themselves somehow fit to be in this role, and you also joked a little bit about different states having different rules and regulations about giving you a certificate or a permit, which in a way I understand cannot be given to you by an institution because you need to know. I'm interested in the possibilities of abuse through this kind of authority one assumes. How if I was an analyzant, or also anyone can be sure that I'm not having, could be sure that I don't encounter like a narcissistic personality who through the role of the analysis, being an analyst also has like a tremendous power over me. I mean, I think the ideal situation is the listening and maybe being able to tease out through questions something out of that is significant for the analysant, as you say, like a very responsive kind of practice. But what if the analyst has an interest in controlling the analysant or having a lot of control of their life? I'm asking that because I'm hearing more and more cases, I mean real cases, of the kind of, also forms of abuse taking place in this process, of overstepping lines and so on. I'm just curious what you think
that's
from
I
your
think,
position
but that's the problem. I think this
such cases where like the kind of distance isn't kept, and analysts invited analyzers into their homes, and things were going on that weren't supposed to go on. But maybe also just in the situation that is still within the normal range.
it was normal. I think that's the.
Well,
but it's a good point that you're talking about. Analytic neutrality is not to protect the analyst from doing dirty things, or the analysant from. It's something that allows the analysis to happen. If you don't have the frame, you cannot have an analysis. It's not It's not that you need a certain moral, well, good behavior. It's the analytic process could be productive if we have a frame that allows it to happen. And I think this is the problem. Is the state supposed to regulate, like in the case of New York, it's the state that enters the analytic space. Even in Italy, for instance, they pass a law that only psychologists can be psychoanalysts. So if they would show up in an office and they would see a couch and a bookshelf, they would arrest the person if they're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So is that the function of regulating? Or the proposition of Lacan with the model of the past, in which there is a school that does not teach you in the sense of giving you a diploma, but gives you a group that will maintain certain form of a transmission of a certain ethical positioning. How do you teach an ethical positioning? So there are all these, and we didn't have a chance to go into the details of the model of the past, that is for some a tremendous failure. So how do we transmit psychoanalysis when in fact what Lacan is saying is that it's a desire that comes from the subject. Suddenly someone wants to become an analyst. So how could you institutionalize a desire? Often desire emerges outside the institution. Again, so it is, I don't have an answer, that's why I'm saying we have to reinvent it. Or it's sort of impossible crossroad, but nevertheless, also there are the laws of the polis. I do happen to have a license in New York to practice. So you need to respond to the laws of the polis, because you are also not only a psychoanalyst, you're also a citizen. And you're good to it's very good to point out that we need to avoid the possibility of someone abusing, taking advantage of a situation that will no longer be analysis if you start having dinner and so on. It's something else. It's maybe a beautiful friendship, but it's no longer analysis.
Okay, this is the problem with the psychoanalysis lectures. Now I feel like I'm being a phallus right here.
No, it's just a canción. Yeah, we live here for today, and you'll dream about it, or have a slip of the tongue.
It's going to be a variable session.
Yes.
Let's say thank you to Dr. Gherovici.
Thank you very much.